I didn't share any of the work I did at NYP, but I was able to share some of the magnitude of the findings and the results.
Hmm.
And I think he'd also been at Citi for a while, and I think he was looking for something more interesting to do. And I
Hmm.
guess I did a good job shucking oysters, as well, which was another plus. Um, and I think what attracted Nathan was, and part of sort of like why I wanted to start SmarterDx as well is, I think there's startups that have this amazing kind of long-term vision, but their short-term value proposition is kind of weak. And so it's like, great, if we can get 100 hospitals worth of data, then we unlock this awesome thing. And it's like, how do you get there? And there's kind of small businesses more commonly that understand the short-term value proposition really well, but like once they solve that, they solve that.
So yeah, with that, I know you were able to join us and present on stage for Founders You Should Know back in December. That was really
Yeah,
exciting. I
that was
think
super fun.
the whole room was like lit up and excited to meet you. I think you got like, some of the, biggest number of connections I think we've seen because I think what you're working on doesn't feel so up to the middle to most people because it's like you have a very different background and how you come to like merge medicine and entrepreneurship is an area that I think is worth like learning more about because I think it probably tells us a bit about you and about the company. So, can you give us a little summary? You're a physician entrepreneur. Like, did you imagine you were going to be an entrepreneur and you were kind of like doing the medicine stuff ahead of time, or did you kind of like plan to go down the pure medical route and then you sort of figured out a passion or transition around entrepreneurship?
Yeah, I didn't go into medicine thinking that I would be an entrepreneur, although looking back, it actually makes a lot of sense. I started a design firm in undergrad. I started two nonprofits in med school. One was a clinic, and one was actually a ZocDoc for people who didn't have health insurance.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when I was in my third year of residency, ZocDoc actually presented to the hospital, trying to sort of sell their services to the hospital. And in that moment, I remember thinking, oh, the set of people who have problems getting healthcare appointments also includes insured people, not just uninsured people.
Mm-hmm.
And so that, experience really rekindled, kind of my interest in entrepreneurship. Um, but at the end of the day, I think it was, it's less about, quote unquote, being an entrepreneur, than it is the opportunity to solve problems at scale, that I think really, sort of pulled me into this direction.
Yep. And it seems like your career as a physician, you were in the hospital, kind of working hands-on in a clinical setting. And then I understand you were working in like an AI kind of
Yeah.
advisory capacity as well. Were those overlapping or was that sort of a different phase of career?
Yeah. So I was, right after residency, I was 25% clinical. So I saw patients as a hospitalist. And then I was 75% sort of leading applied AI with the York Presbyterian Hospital, which included actually getting pitched to by startups. And we had a little venture team, so helping them
Hmm.
with diligence, building out internal projects and deploying stuff as well. So, I think that's what got me exposure, not just to sort of the front end of the hospital where sort of between physicians and patients, but the back end of the hospital and how that runs as well.
And that seems like an early time. That was like before the big AI boom that we're currently in, right? So that was what was that 4 or 5 years ago? You sort of already had a
Yeah.
hospital thinking about AI specific tooling. How did that kind of group come together?
So, I think Peter Fleischer, who leads transformation for New York Presbyterian, David Tsai, who, is also a physician, kind of entrepreneur who actually went to Apple after NYP, kind of formed the basis for that group. Thinking about how technology inflection points potentially could transform healthcare. And AI was very much one of those technologies. And there was another arm that was more about automation. I mean, obviously they overlap a bit, but it was kind of the two big arms of the transformation group. And so I do think it was, sort of pretty visionary, especially for a hospital, to sort of realize the potential impact for AI, 5 years ago. And there was, at the time, I think there was like sort of a first kind of mini AI hype cycle,
Hmm.
which then died down a bit, and obviously the recent sort of much larger sort of level of interest. And so I think it was sort of built off of that first kind of popularization and first hype cycle.
Right. And within your capacity, you were working to try to help identify. It sounds like you met a bunch of startups, and were you also kind of working with teams building internal tools? And what, was there anything else
Yeah.
out of that era that maybe we would have heard of, or other technology kind of ideas that were explored there?
Yeah, so a lot of my focus was initially on using AI for operational efficiency. As an example, if you have five patients in the hospital, they all need an MRI. It's possible that for one or two of those patients, an MRI is the bottleneck to the rest of their care. And
Hmm.
for other patients, an MRI is needed, but it's just needed before discharge, and it doesn't sort of bottleneck care. And so there's kind of an order of imaging studies that you can do that sort of like makes sort of the overall operations much more efficient, and an order that makes it less efficient. Similar concepts can be applied to OR scheduling, optimizing kind of like where you fill in the gaps, and optimizing sort of how you fill people, how you fill things in. And so there was a good amount of kind of internal applications. One of the reasons, though, that I left the hospital to start SmarterDx is, I think it's hard to scale an idea in one hospital outside of the walls of that hospital. And so kind of your impact on the overall healthcare system is, more limited. And yeah, it was really fun working with startups as well. I worked with, a number of kind of healthcare startups, both sort of getting pitched and trying to make decisions about sort of like what we would want to move forward with or contribute to those decisions, which is, as you might imagine, very valuable for figuring out how to do
Yeah.
sales on the other side of the table. Kind of a little bit of a cheat code there.
Yeah, totally,
Um,
totally.
and also helping them actually implement successfully in a hospital environment, which is very difficult. It's a messy environment. People have lots of competing priorities, and sort of how you take sort of an algorithm that maybe works at a theoretical level and sort of make it have practical benefits is, certainly something that's non-trivial.
Right. How are I guess the things you were doing were within the walls of New York Presbyterian? And is that like as a model the kind of thing that works? Like if you get it to work there, you can get it to work across. I think you said there's like maybe 6,000 other care facilities. Are they generally similar decision making, similar workflows, or is kind of everything a unique snowflake?
The challenge with the operational side is on the operational side, it is a little bit of if you've seen one hospital, you've seen one hospital. And everybody is a bit of a unique snowflake. And it's hard to find problems where you can solve that same problem the same way across, 6,000 hospitals, which obviously presents sort of scaling difficulties for your average healthcare startup. I think the lack of scaling outside of New York Presbyterian was in part because of just that difficulty generally. But in part, it just wasn't the mandate, right? So the
Hmm.
hospital invested money. What it wanted to do is improve its own operations and own efficiency. And although theoretically it would benefit from potentially productizing something and selling that to the market sort of more broadly, sort of the expertise to do that, was not sort of like present within the hospital. You don't
Hmm.
recruit people with the intention of doing that. And so then, even if something is worth kind of productizing and scaling globally, you don't have the kind of internal sort of people who can do that for the hospital.
Hmm. So when you were starting, so SmarterDX, we should talk about because it's fundamentally it's like a billing platform today. Is that the right way to think about it?
Yeah, I would say it's kind of a billing accuracy platform,
Hmm.
where hospitals make sort of lots of errors, both of sort of omission, and of having stuff that shouldn't be there.
Hmm.
And the other way I would think about it is, you know, billing is mostly a tug of war between hospitals and insurance companies. And insurance companies who have, 500, $600 billion a year in revenue, genuinely, it's that many billions,
Wow.
are really good at setting up data science teams, internal tooling to figure out every possible reason to deny payment on something, which
Hmm.
I'm sure we've all kind of personally experienced in some format. And so, in a way, it's about billing accuracy. In another way, it's about evening the playing field a little bit between the people who provide care and insurance companies.
Right. And so when you started this, I guess you already saw these kinds of billing problems within the hospital, within New York Presbyterian where you're working. Were they kind of an obvious first, patient zero, kind of for first customer for this, or did you sort of look outside to try to find more commonality across hospitals, ensure that you're building something that had more general nature to it?
Yeah. So we looked outside. So actually, our first two customers, were one was another kind of academic medical center within New York, and another was a community hospital in the Midwest in Michigan. And so, I really wanted to. I think it's important as a founder to kind of address the biggest risks that would kill your company first.
Hmm.
And certainly one of the biggest risks was this was true in one hospital, but nowhere else.
Right.
And so, sort of like our first two customers are not just not New York Presbyterian, but are different types of hospital. So validating that the problem, not just that the problem was there in both places, but that we could solve it the same way in both places was really critical.
Right. And so if you can solve it, at least in those two cases, then each of those have similarities, hundreds at least, or maybe thousands of similar, community
Exactly.
hospital or kind of research.
And since then, we've sort of fully deployed in, about half a dozen hospitals. We have not yet encountered a hospital where we haven't found them several $1 million worth of sort of additional revenue.
Wow.
And that includes top 20 sort of, US News and World Report hospitals, small community hospitals, for-profit hospitals, kind of the entire spectrum. Which means that in a sense, sort of, we're kind of like post crossing the chasm, right? It's like we know that our product isn't just good for early adopter types, but kind of
Hmm.
for your bread and butter meat and potato hospital types.
Right. And finding millions of dollars doesn't sound like it's easy, just kind of lying around. So, are there certain characteristics of the way that you have discovered to be able to push back against the insurance companies, maybe data science to sort of level the playing field, or are they sort of a little bit more haphazard where these opportunities emerge at each hospital, like maybe situation specific?
Yeah, they're actually pretty consistent. Like we use the same set of algorithms across all of our customers. I think there were three pretty key things that we figured out how to do well. That actually I think all three would have been hard if kind of the founding team didn't have both a clinical and data science background.
Hmm.
Uh, One is that all hospitals have slightly different data schemas, even within the same electronic medical record. So figuring out how to map that onto a consistent schema at scale was sort of problem number one. Number two is sort of how to figure out to sort of like define features, and not just sort of simple features, but complex features at scale. And so what I mean by that is, as an example, if a patient's on oxygen in the emergency room, it's a very good feature for something like pneumonia or respiratory failure. But if they're on oxygen in the operating room, it's a terrible feature, right? They're literally just getting surgery. They're under anesthesia. That's why you need to give them extra oxygen. And if you had billions of patient records, you could just throw that into a bucket of linear algebra, shake it around, and sort of the association between oxygen and location would fall out. But
Hmm.
if you have sort of reasonable numbers of records, it doesn't. So you have to sort of like define sort of your features very carefully for good performance. And then the third is that, if you just do your traditional supervised learning approaches, you're recreating the same errors that the hospital had in the past, right? Because your labels are just what they did before. And so figuring out how to sort of label a set of data to train against, I think was the third big breakthrough.
We're talking about the features that you can observe in kind of sort of, if you have a big data set, then you can actually shake it up with linear algebra and distill these features. But were you saying that because you're working on a small data set to start with, that do you have like an extra role that needs to identify these features or make guesses at that?
Yeah, exactly. Although, what I would clarify though is even a fairly large hospital, a health system actually with multiple hospitals only discharges on the order of, say, 100,000 patients a year. So there are no data sets in healthcare that are sort of similar in size to, like the whole of internet text, right? Which was, like used for OpenAI and Bard. And so you do have to be more deliberate and more kind of intentional about how you approach sort of cleaning, feature selection, and labels.
Right. And you mentioned kind of the founding team has some of that data science background already. Can you tell us a little bit more? Because I don't think we got to that when we talked before. What's the founding team of SmarterDx look like?
Yeah, so there's myself, Josh, who oversees product, also a superstar. He's a physician. He was actually a founding engineer at his own company prior to med school. And then he did data science work funded by the DoD, after med school. So another kind of similar bent, clinician with a technical bent. And then Nathan, who was the global director for quant engineering at Citi. And so, as you might imagine with that, tons of data pipelining, a lot of, quant work is kind of MLE, and sort of a lot of kind of custom development around sort of, various quant strategies. And so, really, I think the three of us iterated through sort of a lot of sort of early versions to kind of get the algorithms off the ground.
And how did you originally get the band together? Are these people you knew from your previous life as a physician or otherwise socially? Or
Yeah. So Nathan, I met at a party, and I knew I wanted to work with him at some point because he bought a bunch of oysters, and like we could all just chuck oysters at a party. And I was like, all right, cool. Even if he sucks technically, at least we'll have a lot of fun eating oysters together.
And he's pitching and doing the shucking too, so it's like a good signal that he's willing to put some work in.
And then Josh and I actually did residency together. So we knew each other during residency, and kind of like knew about each other's interests a bit that way.
And did you guys? It sounds like he already had some entrepreneurial leanings, or at least he ended up pursuing some entrepreneurial leanings too. So was that something that you guys maybe talked about during residency even?
Funnily enough, not really. I think residency is kind of, all encompassing enough, that, a lot of times that's kind of what residents also end up talking about is like, how their day was. But Josh also did, some kind of like informatics and data science work for New York Presbyterian. So it was actually after residency that we started really bonding, sort of talking about data science and talking about entrepreneurship. And with respect to the specific problem we're solving, when I was at New York Presbyterian, I was just writing like literally some SQL scripts, sort of very rules-based stuff to validate the problem. And, sort of was like, holy crap, if I can find, several $1 million with just SQL, and some rules, it just like imagine how awesome, this could really be.
Right. And it sounds like, was it Nathan already had a pretty big expertise in data pipelines and stuff like that. So when you were originally talking to him about it, were you kind of just showing the SQL work that you had done and kind of getting his buy-in or feedback on that?
Um, you know, I didn't share any of the work I did at NYP, but I was able to share some of the magnitude of the findings and the results.
Hmm.
And I think he'd also been at Citi for a while, and I think he was looking for something more interesting to do. And
Hmm.
I guess I did a good job shucking oysters, as well, which was another plus. Um, and I think what attracted Nathan was, and part of sort of like why I wanted to start SmarterDx as well is, I think there's startups that have this amazing kind of long-term vision, but their short-term value proposition is kind of weak. And so it's like, great, if we can get 100 hospitals worth of data, then we unlock this awesome thing. And it's like, how do you get there? And there's kind of small businesses more commonly that understand the short-term value proposition really well. But, like once they solve that, they solve that. And I think what's really cool about SmarterDX is the short-term value proposition for hospitals is literally more revenue, right? Which is like the strongest value
Yep.
proposition there is in enterprise sales. It's healthcare, so this space by itself, if we capture 10% of the market, is a $100 million a year business. But what we're getting from hospitals is a complete set of clinical data and a complete set of financial data, which means it's like, what enterprise product for hospitals wouldn't be better off with all of that data as an input, especially as, I think sort of software workflows get built around AI. And so I think what's really cool is it's an idea that, and I try not to exaggerate these things. It's an idea that genuinely has, sort of like rebuilding hospital administration around AI workflows is $100 billion or even more possibility, but it has the short-term value, that kind of allows you to have amazing growth to really get there.
Yeah, it's nice when you get to really balance the two because I agree. I think there's a lot of times you can get stuck with great vision but no path to get there, or you can have like a really nice focused path but it kind of like peters out. And I think you've got a really strong value prop of like, we're going to help you find some money, and so everybody's going to like, light up to that. But then you've got a lot of directions this can go. So when I think about like where could this go, it feels to me like there's some sort of system of record potentially here around this like hospital administrative workflow. But I wonder, like, is there a good way to articulate, is the system of record the right way to think about it? And if so, like, what is the system that is being recorded here, or kind of where will this be the system of truth? Is it around just the billing side, or around like the number of, kind of, I don't know, is it around the devices bought or the number of operations performed? Or how do we think about like what is the system of record here?
I think there's two sort of big areas, this can go. One is that, you alluded to this, but, when you think about fixing billing, what you're really fixing is the structured representation of what happened to patients. And so, if we are the ones generating a more complete and more accurate representation of what happens to patients, then that sort of new data set, can be used for any number of operations. So there's kind of a data layer sort of play to it. And then there's also what I would think of as more fundamentally a product play. And one way to think about enterprise hospital software today is they're, for the most part, they're just a digital recreation of the manual workflow that they, were in its hospitals. So like in the 1990s and early 2000s.
Mm-hmm.
And so, by that, what I mean is an example is insurance companies deny stuff, right? And so all the denials go to the hospital. It used to be a pile of denial letters that they would kind of go through. And now it's a software version. It's a row of denials. It maybe allows you to sort by dollar amount. So you go from, top dollar amounts to low dollar amounts, but a person is fundamentally doing all the work. That's true for denials. It's true for the authorization process. It's true for coding, sort of like like many parts of hospital administration. And kind of our thesis here on the product side is that if we have accurate data and as algorithms get better, you can go from kind of a work list approach to an exception-based approach where, hey, if an insurance company denies a case and they say, you know what, there's no evidence this patient had pneumonia. Actually, with the clinical data we have, we can pull in all the evidence supporting pneumonia, and we can just write that denial letter for the hospital. And really, a person only needs to get involved to verify it, or if it's a gray area case that we're not sure about. And so that's, I think, where you're starting to get kind of in every aspect of kind of the hospital back end, like really 10x improvements in efficiency, as well as sort of improvements in accuracy, standardization of work, and potentially outcomes as well.
Right.
And so yeah.
Like these insurance companies have pretty automated workflows where they do the denials, but that the providers don't have that automated, so they're kind of done by hand today. Is that kind of mostly the imbalance that's happening?
Yeah, that's a huge imbalance that's there, where it doesn't cost insurance companies anything to deny a chart, because unless the provider then spends resources to argue why it should be approved, like by default, they're not going to get paid for it. And so from an insurance company standpoint, it makes sort of like in a ruthless way, business sense to, sort of, if you're not sure, deny something and
right.
sort of like, or request more information. And then unless the hospital spends resources to put that together, by default, they don't get paid. And so, it kind of results in an imbalance, where sort of one side sort of just has more resources and it's cheaper for them to do that action. And the other side hospitals have fewer resources and it's more expensive.
Right. So I love this pattern in technology. And I think it's usually where a lot of the value gets created is when you have this asymmetric set of relationships in the world where somebody has a lot of influence, power, resources somehow, and they sort of use that to abuse their position in the market. And so when a new technology can come in and empower the little guy to have more resources to be able to kind of fight the David versus Goliath fight, you sort of every proto David out there wants to use this new technology.
Yeah.
So it's a great pattern. And so when kind of thinking about sort of where we are today with SmarterDx, you mentioned kind of these two kind of ways to think about the platform. Are there certain like big unlocks that you're looking for next? Like maybe it's a new type of customer to validate one side of that platform vision or another, or you kind of want to do more with kind of the existing customers or kind of like sell more into the existing style of customers and just kind of prove that that's more repeatable and scalable? Or sort of how do you think about sort of the next steps from where we are?
When you have customers that love you, it's always easier to sell into existing customers. Because, what I would say is when you've basically handed the CFO a multi-million-dollar check, and when the users also love using your software, then when you go to them with the next idea, they're extremely receptive about working with you on that idea. And so, one way I think about building new products is sort of earning the right to do so.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people think about it in this framework, which is great. The data gives us sort of a technological right to be able to build a product with certain advantages over existing products. The sort of users give us a right to give them more things to do, right? Because, like they've enjoyed sort of working with us. And then sort of the rock solid value proposition means that the next product can have a bit softer of a value proposition, right? Like, okay, your appeal rate against denials will be a couple percentage points higher a few months from now.
Mm-hmm.
But because you started from a very sort of rock solid place, you've kind of won that trust that you're not just sort of hoodwinking them into buying software as well. And so, what's been really, quite amazing actually is of our first sort of 4 first customers. Every single one has sort of either talked about us at conferences or referenced us to new hospitals,
Hmm.
which is, sort of like pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Especially when your first 4 customers, you always make some mistakes here and there in
Right.
terms of,
Yeah.
the
You're building the
software
ship while
build
you,
or deployment.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. And so out of these 4 customers, I think you had announced that you already had, are you kind of in a multi-million dollar run rate range with that?
Yeah.
And so these
Yeah.
are big,
So
big deployments.
yeah, I mean, we ended last year at about 1 million, and we'll end this year. And I know because hospitals take a while to sell to, like 9
Yeah.
to 14 months. So you kind of already know kind of like what your run rate's going to be in a year's time frame. We'll end this year at around 6. And then we're expecting to end probably the first half of next year around 15.
Hmm.
So we're roughly speaking on track to about 25x over a 2-year period.
Wow. Very, very impressive growth and not at small
Yeah.
numbers either. Um, do you think about the way that the revenue flows? Is it mostly through kind of selling a deployment, or is it sharing in the kind of additional revenue captured? Or how, like, do you feel like that
Yeah.
part is figured out now, or that's still sort of experimental?
Um, Certainly at our stage, it's easiest to share in the upside. And there's 2 reasons. One is pretty obvious, which is there's no financial risk for the hospital. It delays our cash flow a bit relative to a, standard ARR contract. But the second thing is actually more interesting, which is that for the most part, hospitals are missing out on a lot more dollars than they realize. And so they actually wouldn't pay us the amounts that they're paying us on an ARR contract, even if they believed in us, because they don't actually think they're missing that much.
Right.
But when we help them capture it, it sort of, it allows, and, it kind of like allows us to actually get a lot more revenue on a per customer basis.
Right. It's really nice alignment in that, like, you take on the risk with your customers. And if you actually are able to deliver, which I think presumably it's already proving that you are, then you actually get to participate in all that upside instead of just being like a monthly service provider kind of pricing. So I think, it's maybe a harder business to get started in this style, but a better business long run to be able to participate in that way. Are there other IT kind of healthcare? I'm not super familiar with all the details of the market here, but I do know that there's some like monopolies in the medical record space that may be protective of their data moats. And I wonder, like, do you run into anything competitive, or do they push back against this kind of service, or they try to get into the same kind of thing, or is this like far enough afield from what they see as their role?
I think it's pretty far afield from what they see as their role. What I would say is that when you need data for kind of like clinical care purposes, you need, like, for clinical care, you need really live data, right? It's like, it's not useful to tell a doctor, oh, this might be, sepsis 20 minutes later. And so you need sort of very tight integration with the medical record. And so I think that's where, sort of, if you don't play by their rules, or there's a business reason not to work with you, you know, you can scale up and then kind of get, sort of shut down. On the revenue cycle side, luckily, it's asynchronous with patient care. And so we're just getting sort of using flat files, really from the hospital, to sort of ingest the data and do our work. So it's both kind of from a business strategy perspective, far enough removed from the existing sort of medical record companies, but also from an integration perspective, less integrated and more just kind of getting copies of stuff.
Right. Well, I mean, it sounds like such a great idea. I'm almost surprised that it hasn't happened before. So, like, what was there some change in the market that enabled it to finally be the case? Was there a breakthrough in AI or the sales process that you were just close enough to that you figured it out, or how did you unlock this, and why didn't it happen in the market just earlier?
I don't think there was any one thing that sort of made it go from impossible to possible. I think what's hard about healthcare is there's a lot of steps that each weed out 90% of possible players. And when you kind of add them all up together, you've kind of like weeded out, 99.999% of possible players.
Right.
So, understanding how to get data out of EMRs is sort of like one thing that causes 90% of people to drop out.
Mm-hmm.
Selling to hospitals is famously difficult. So that's another thing that causes another 90% of people to drop out. I would say we were able to do between the three of us, kind of enough data engineering and data science work that, I would even say probably, 10 years prior was just sort of would not have been remotely possible.
Mm-hmm.
And so that would have caused another 90% of people to drop out. And then I do think the data science work is sufficiently different from what, a data scientist at Google would experience
Mm-hmm.
because of the difference in sort of scale of data, that, kind of 90% of data scientists even sort of probably wouldn't, necessarily be able to make that sort of transition, into it, or at least intuit that transition. So I think it's kind of like no one thing moved from like, we're the only people in the world that can do this. But I think if you have four things that are 90% each, then
Right.
you get to like 99
A
point
bunch of hurdles that kind of
99
weed
right there.
everybody out. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And so when did you get to start? I mean, after the three of you kind of proved out some of the initial hypotheses here, when did you start sort of building out the broader team? And was that sort of pretty early on in the process, or was that sort of after you'd already signed a customer or pilot?
Yeah. So the three of us alone, kind of built out the initial platform. We got signed customers, and then we raised our seed round, with Floodgate. And then we started sort of, building out a team. And so, the team's about 17 people, kind of a mix of, really fantastic, engineers, a former, board member on the Apache Software Foundation, people who have worked at the usual kind of Google, Amazon
Mm-hmm.
plus startup, backgrounds, a really great data science team, a person who is doing data science at Optum, one of the payers, so kind of
Mm.
on the other side of the table, initially, kind of like Stanford PhD data science types,
Mm-hmm.
and then I think a really great product team. I'm slightly biased about kind of our own people, of course, who actually have a decent amount of healthcare understanding and kind of knows what it takes to deploy and operationalize within healthcare.
Right. And what are sort of the next priorities? Like, do you have priorities right now within hiring, or how do you think about sort of what you need to augment the team?
Yeah, I think engineering, especially I would say kind of I'm going to kind of name all of engineering here, I guess, like backend, DevOps,
Mm-hmm.
and ML ops are probably three of the biggest areas. Data science is another area, and probably customer success is the third area. We're going to go from kind of a handful of customers to dozens of customers in a short period of time. Broadly, I would say though that when you're growing kind of, 5 or 6x a year, anything that's not a need today is likely to be a need within 3 months. So, you
Right.
know, kind of the other way I'm kind of approaching this is if there's just really talented, awesome people, we can probably figure out a way to, work with them.
And so it doesn't necessarily matter maybe if they have specific healthcare background or if they have specific ML background. It could be a backend engineer or a full stack engineer, but somebody who's excited about the problem and wants to contribute to the
Absolutely.
mission.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, certainly if you're like customer success for hospital users, it's probably helpful to have some healthcare background. But on the engineering side, no healthcare experience is necessary.
Right. And on that customer success thing, I think you mentioned from one of the payers. Was that where one of your
So
first
that was
customer
one of the
success?
data scientists,
One of the data
actually.
scientists.
Yeah.
So what would be a typical background for like a customer success person? Like they had just broadly within healthcare somewhere, or were they sort of on the other side of the table as a payer? Or
Probably some sort of consulting background and some sort of healthcare background. And of course, there's people with healthcare consulting backgrounds, which would
Right.
make that super straightforward. But broadly, I think it's useful when a customer kind of asks about something within healthcare that there's some framework for kind of understanding that. And then sort of like the consulting imparts kind of like an ability to put together lots of PowerPoints, kind of organize things, add timelines and things like that. So it doesn't have to be consulting, right? But it's sort of somebody who has a process, sort of who's process minded, who also can kind of fluidly talk to people within healthcare.
Right. And what does the cadence of like work and decision making feel like at SmarterDx? Because I can imagine you have a bunch of different priorities from how you do sales and how you sort of deliver for existing customers, how you develop future stuff. Can you give us a little bit of a like day in the life or week in the life of kind of a typical smarter DXer?
Yeah. I think there's certain roles that you can primarily work on sort of putting out fires, so to speak, last minute stuff, without a massive decrease in productivity, and other roles where that actually does cause a pretty significant decrease in productivity. So the example I would say is if a person with a consulting background needs to put together a last minute PowerPoint, that's great. That's like kind of how consultants,
Mm-hmm.
often work. If an engineer kind of doing deep work on a specific product gets pulled randomly into another product for half a day, that you've kind of like killed a lot of them.
Yep.
And so we try to, within obviously the limits of a sort of fast moving startup, provide a good amount of, um, uh, I guess I'll put it this way. We try to communicate what the biggest risks we're trying to solve are. And then we try to sort of insulate as much as we can, which sometimes isn't that much, to be honest, but as
Mm-hmm.
much as we can against kind of, like last minute sort of shifts. Um, uh, as a company, I think we do a really good job um, moving quickly when we have conviction. And so there's people whom we've gone from first email to hired within a 3 day, time
Wow.
period. It's not to say that if you're talking to us and you're on your fourth day, it means we don't have conviction, just to be clear. But,
Right.
we do try to sort of, you know, make decisions and, move pretty quickly. And what that means sort of functionally is we care a lot about being very communicative and transparent about the challenges we're facing, to hire people whose decisions we trust, and then to decentralize decision making, such that it doesn't have to be sort of a vote by committee before a decision is made.
Mm-hmm. How does the kind of decentralization work? Because it seems like you mentioned trust, you have to sort of develop trust and rapport with teammates in order to be able to develop that trust. But do you guys have a kind of a process in your interview thing where you're able to sort of interview loops help you figure that out? And that's like a particular mark that you rate on, or how do you sort of figure out if you're going to be likely to establish that trust?
Yeah, I think we try to ask in the interview some judgment questions, to try to see how they think through certain things. And we try to sort of, keep people extremely looped in, especially within their first 1 or 2 months in the company.
Mm-hmm.
So they, really have an idea of what's going on. So, as an example, if somebody comes on the team and they report to me, their first month is basically as much as possible, like joining every single meeting that I'm part of.
Mm-hmm.
And, I kind of get a sense of how they make decisions, but also importantly, they get a sense of how I make decisions,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of like what sort of factors I'm balancing against. And I think oftentimes when people make wrong decisions, presuming it's a smart person with a good track record and everything like that, it's often not because they just like aren't constitutionally incapable of sort of weighing the positives and negatives. It's because they haven't sort of acclimated to how the company sort of thinks about things, or kind of like what types of risks the company sort of, or the weights associated with those risks.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think as much as possible, sort of looping people in closely, and then that period of working together really closely in the beginning also sort of allows me to build trust in that person, right? So it's not just the interview now; it's sort of like a month of working together really closely.
Right. And then when you're thinking through kind of how the actual communication for decision making works, are you sort of more of a written culture, or like a calls, video and voice calls, or do you meet, like, how do you sort of embody
Yeah.
the decision making process?
Um, it's a combination of things. We do have sort of a written culture, I would say. So there's kind of a document, and it's kind of like, here are my priorities. This is what I'm thinking about. This is the risk I'm trying to address. These are the potential downsides. This is the potential upside. I think documents like that are useful for getting people on the same page with respect to kind of like the basic facts of, surrounding a decision. But it ultimately have not found that it replaces a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, oftentimes that just ends up being a Slack huddle or a call. And related to that, I think, we're a remote company. And so I think one thing that's very important is to have that level of comfort to just reach out to somebody and, have a verbal conversation with them without feeling like you're interrupting them. And, like there's a certain amount of deep work that we try to respect, as well. So, I think it's a balance between the two factors. But I think if you go too far and sort of like not bothering people except on a scheduled basis, then it's like really hard to sort of build any sort of rapport or culture.
Right. How did you decide to build the team in a remote way? Was that sort of a factor given sort of when it started, and was some of the maybe the pandemic stuff that was happening as you were growing?
Yeah, so there was the pandemic stuff, and then there was, mid 2021, which is when we started, kind of like really started was sort of like peak sort of zero interest rate bubble. And so,
Mm-hmm.
if you wanted to hire somebody who, had the right things on their resume, lived in San Francisco or New York, that person was getting 15 different offers on a daily basis from everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I think we made a decision that if we found really good people and they just happened to be in North Carolina or Texas or something like that, it would be silly not to sort of hire them. Then from there, the question is, well, if you just do in person, but some people are remote, quote unquote hybrid,
Mm-hmm.
then it's easy to accidentally form kind of a dual class culture.
Yeah.
And so, kind of made a decision just for, everybody to work remote. If we get big enough that we can have kind of multiple geographic hubs, and some people don't like working from home as much, sort of that may change. But, at least at our size, we found that being all remote works pretty well.
Right. And is that mostly kind of North America or time zone overlapping, or how do you think about sort of the locations that are supported?
Yeah. All healthcare data, at least currently, needs to stay within the continental US. Within the US, I suppose it's fine if they're outside in Hawaii or
Mm-hmm.
Alaska or something. And so that's, sort of where we've been hiring. There's not a huge pool of engineers in Alaska, so we haven't had to deal with, that as an
Right.
issue. So everybody's kind of like, PST to EST, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. And you couldn't hire from like LATAM or something with given sort of the regulatory stuff around this healthcare data?
I think once we are mature enough to fully separate sort of the actual healthcare data from the development side of the world, with anonymized data and stuff like that, then, we could hire from Latin America. And from a time zone perspective, that's and actually from what I've heard from a talent perspective, that's a great, kind of area to hire from. But we're just not ready for that, at our stage.
Right. Makes sense. Switching gears a little bit, I know that you haven't been talking about the company as like an AI focused company, but there's, like you said, the data science and the ML stuff that kind of underlies a lot of it. And, I think it's generally a good pattern to be like very focused on like the customer needs and the value prop. And if AI helps strengthen that, so be it, and great, that's an opportunity. And I wonder, given sort of all of the new tooling that we're seeing in AI and ML, do any of the new things seem maybe relevant to the types of problems that you're solving, that you could sort of like off the shelf plug in, I don't know, an LLM or other kinds of ML infrastructure that people are playing with these days? Or is it more, you're sort of focused on whatever solves the customer problem, and those things so far you haven't experimented with to solve these kinds of customer problems?
Yeah, we've experimented with a lot with using sort of language models too. I mentioned like if you get a denial, then you have to write an appeal letter, like to take not just the classification problem, but to kind of like start the next step for the hospital user. And also using that as a way to get sort of features out of unstructured data. We found that sort of like those two, kind of like the more generative case and the sort of feature extraction case, is been more useful than sort of its ability to classify things correctly. So I think sort of like both of those aspects are, sort of things we're very actively exploring. I kind of agree with you. I think there's true AI companies, right? Which is like, you're literally doing, I don't know, you're researching the next model beyond transformers, or, you're training up a foundational algorithm that gets used by everybody. That's a true kind of AI company. If you're fundamentally an application that uses AI, you should be very focused on the problem the application solves. And I think it's very fair, and it's true that AI is unlocking kind of new approaches to applications, and applications that sort of before wouldn't have been possible. So it's a useful signal to investors and potentially employees as to sort of the framing of your company. But what I would say is, I think what I'm seeing is a lot of founders buy into sort of VC hype when all that matters is market hype. And no amount of VC hype sort of replaces market hype.
Right. And it sounds like you've got market hype going well because your customers are telling other people they should be customers and they should look at it. So that's the good kind of hype.
Yeah, and if you solve that, it turns out it's like pretty easy to solve for the funding side.
Right. Do you do all of the sales personally today, or do you have other people on the team who are very involved in that process?
Yeah, so we've kind of transitioned actually in the past couple months, I would say, from principally founder-led sales to sort of sales team-led sales. And sort of the mark of that transition was when sort of one of our early sales hires was sort of like able to take from first conversation to close to contracting without sort of any of my involvement. And once we realized that sort of like we knew sort of what we were selling and how to sell it, we brought on a chief commercial officer, actually, who's done the 10 million to 100 million stage 3 different times, sort of all within kind of healthcare, and actually a couple times within revenue cycle. And so now sort of it's just about, not just about, it's principally about sort of like scaling out that sales function.
Right. So you've got like a repeatable process or semi-repeatable process that you can now kind of go after.
Yeah.
That's great.
Exactly.
And when you think about sort of, I mean, this is such a, impressive amount of traction, but it's a small early beginning into a massive, massive market, maybe the biggest market that we have. I don't know. What are the biggest things that like stress you out or keep you worried about, like the next, flipping over the next card, getting the next kind of success case? Is it another sale? Is it deeper with existing customers? Is it some other kind of technology breakthrough that you're waiting for, hoping for?
Yeah. So I would say, the thing that stresses me out the most is how we can scale up the company to deliver product 1 fast enough, while also scaling up the company to build out product 2 and 3. I think that with, I think with a lot of AI becoming much easier because the foundational models are much better and sort of like more people are knowledgeable about it. Um, it's kind of probably like a land grab, so to speak, for products 2 and 3. And the advantage we have is product 1 provides a massive distribution boost
Mm-hmm.
to, kind of future products as well. But, you know, like 5 years ago, a rational decision might be, okay, let's first scale up product 1, get to 50, 100 hospitals, get revenue at scale. You're getting 30 million in ARR a year. And then like only when that's good should we focus on product 2. But I think the landscape is changing fast enough, which always provides new opportunities for new entrants, that the sort of right strategy is actually not to wait, kind of until product 1 is like sort of like deploys without any of my involvement or something.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're making sort of investments into future products sort of early on, which kind of means we're scaling in sort of 2 sort of orthogonal axes. And I would say that's probably what's keeping me up the most.
Right. And if you have kind of product 2 and product 3 ideas already in sort of in view, it almost feels like that kind of thing could be attractive to somebody who might be, an entrepreneurial engineer who kind of wants to be able to take something, kind of from 0 to 1, but with enough stability and foundation and, a company and revenue and stuff like that. So
Yeah,
I wonder, like,
absolutely.
when it's time to do that, how do you think about assembling those teams or getting the right type of talent that's excited about that, or how do you go about that process?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're very excited when we talk to engineers with either founding experience or kind of like early company experience. Um, and because oftentimes that experience helps them sort of think more in terms of like what product am I building as opposed to what technologies am I using. And so, you know, we have obviously there's the free cash flow generated by product 1. And then there's this like really awesome data layer, right? That's like this universal data layer that can be used for other products. And sort of like actual hospital people to talk to if
Mm-hmm.
you want to talk to hospital people and learn about healthcare. Um, Not to mention like, Josh and myself make pretty good sounding boards for like, hey, would this work, within healthcare?
Right.
Um, and so I think that for the right person, they can kind of join the company and sort of like very quickly explore what product 2 might be, whether it has product market fit, and sort of like get the resources to, scale that up in a way that frankly would take probably, 3 to 4 years of learning, sort of, as a sort of solo founder, so to speak.
Right. So that's pretty cool. But I guess like if somebody's new into the org, you maybe haven't developed all of the trust yet, so they would maybe need to go through some of that 0 to 1 process with you. That I would just presume that need part of a foundation for that relationship. So
Yeah.
do you think of it as, would you be open to hiring somebody externally to come in and own that, and you sort of bootstrap that process with them quickly?
I I think there's a good amount of like scaling product 1 work to do that would help us, sort of build trust in that person. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's like you have to first have shown that there's not like a sort of like a tautological, like, okay, if you show that you're successful in building product number 2, then at that point we'll trust you to build
Right.
product number 2 sort of trap. I think there's a lot of kind of like metal, sort of smarts, willingness to that can be proven just with sort of helping us scale product 1. I think there's also kind of, as an example, we go to client sites sometimes, and sort of like sit down with them, sort of like understand the problem they're going through. And so there's kind of a sort of role that looks more like kind of like forward deployed engineer like,
Mm-hmm.
so to speak, where you're really getting immersed into healthcare. And what I'll say is when they're already your customer, you get like a level of permission and a level of transparency that, you can't get just from like getting people to speak to you for 30 minutes, out of their day. Um, And so I think, if a person's excited about sort of building and scaling up product number two, I'd say like those are the two areas in which they can really demonstrate that they're the right person. Um, uh, and then sort of as mentioned, once we try to build trust, and then we kind of try to decentralize decision making. And
Hmm.
so if we can get there to that level of trust with a person, then certainly we can kind of like scale the resources behind them sort of, as quickly as sort of it can be justified, so to speak.
Right. Makes sense. And then, kind of on the company financing side, I know that as the world is melting down, and you mentioned the zero interest rate phenomenon, and that environment has changed. And so, I think back when we had you on stage at Founders You Should Know in December, you had only raised the seed, and then I think subsequent to that, if I recall, or I think you mentioned the seed was led by Floodgate. Is that
Floodgate,
right?
yep.
Okay, cool. So great seed. And then kind of when my understanding is, what was it in the recent month or two that you just did the Series A?
Yeah, yeah. So it was about a year in between seed and A, and we raised our A from Bessemer at a nice kind of step up from our seed. I think just reflecting on kind of the progress that we were able to make, on the revenue side. Um, and Steve Kraus, the partner at Bessemer, he's been in healthcare since I want to say it was something like 2005, so since even before the first financial crisis. So,
Mm-hmm.
well, I guess, the Great Depression maybe was the first one. So, before the first one of this millennium. And
The
so,
modern.
he's, I think it's we're super excited to, be working with him since he's really kind of seen it all within healthcare. And, I think, is also kind of very sophisticated with respect to sort of like what actually works and what actually doesn't work within the healthcare space.
Hmm. And my guess with this new financing now, you've substantially, and all the new revenue and growth you've got coming in, you've got like a substantially longer runway. Because I think at the time you were shy about
Yeah.
only having 18 months, and now I guess that must be years.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, I mean, we now have about like 3, 4 years of runway. If we do things correctly, it might be infinite runway, like we
Hmm.
have great gross margins on
Yeah.
our kind of current product. So if that scales up in revenue, that could fund sort of a lot of the company. And so, yeah, I think, what I would say also actually is at the time of raising our A round, we actually had more than half of our seed funding
Mm.
still in the bank.
Oh,
Um, and so, we've been pretty intentional about building out kind of a small team of Navy SEALs, so to speak,
hmm.
rather than sort of sort of a large capital intensive team that is kind of slow moving.
Right. And just thinking again about the team, because I know we visited the team before, but I neglected to find out about, as a remote team, uh, do you guys have times when you all do get together in the same place? And how do you sort of think about what it's like to get people together and sort of the frequency, cadence, purpose of that?
Yeah, we're starting to do that. We'll probably do that sort of biannually for now, and then maybe start to try to do that quarterly or so. I think there are certain kind of pockets of people. New York City is a cluster. Kind of like the Bay Area, as you might expect, is a bit of a cluster. And I'm in both places, pretty frequently. And so I think there's kind of sort of less formal, kind of informal get-togethers as well.
Hmm. Meaning, so you'll, when you're in New York, you're in the Bay Area, you'll get a bunch of people together, you guys all grab dinner
Yeah,
together, do stuff,
exactly.
kind of team building,
Yeah,
team
yeah.
bonding.
It's always good to, it's kind of funny because I think, sometimes when you meet people for the first time, they're like very different in person, like just
Right.
just like appearance wise than they are over Zoom.
Uh-huh.
Um, and so it's kind of funny to take a guess as to like, okay, how tall is this person? And then you meet them and you're like, oh, okay, cool. I was like wildly off, or I was like spot on.
Right. The guessing game, you should have an office pool for it.
Yeah, that's actually a good idea. We'll have like a betting circle, like, like, yeah, some sort of characteristic. And then, kind of when we all meet in person, we can sort of see who ranked, who
Right.
had the
Resolve it all.
lowest, deviation,
Yeah. Who's just
from
sitting
the,
on a high
yeah,
chair in Zoom?
yeah, exactly.
The camera angle got it.
Yeah. The
Well, this is
Citizen
great.
Kane camera angle,
Yeah. Well, this is great. I'm glad we got a chance to hang out and learn more about SmarterDX and your background. Well, thanks for making the time to chat, and we'll get this thing out there and get more people hearing about your story.
Awesome. Appreciate it, DK.